So I'm very excited to have this panel on British and Irish postdoctoral schemes, chaired by Jordan. Okay, well, we're just going to get started because we always have so many questions at the end, and it's good to maximize the time. So I'm Alison Garden, for those of you who weren't here this morning. You're really welcome. This is the third panel of ECR Day 2022 on British and Irish postdoctoral schemes. So what I will do is I'll just do a little bit of an introduction and then Jordan will take the reins. So just some housekeeping, we will present in the order listed on the programme. Jordan will introduce every speaker before their talk, and then we'll take questions at the end. Please use the Q&A box to ask questions. You can do so at any point during people's talks. Just if you think of something, put it in there, and we'll get to it at the end. Please don't use the chat function for questions because they might get lost. If you would like to tweet about the event, please use the hashtag ECRDay2022. And if you're sharing an image of somebody's face or one of their slides, please make sure you quote them and you cite them appropriately. So now I'm just going to hand over to Jordan, but first I will introduce him. So Jordan is a PhD candidate here in French Studies at Queen's University Belfast, and his PhD is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council Northern Bridge Doctoral Consortium, and his research is centred on contemporary parental grief narratives, and his wider research interests are in the area of French Studies, the medical humanities and death studies, and he is the author of a number of articles in this area. He is the postgraduate representative for the Association for French and Francophone Studies in Ireland and chairs the Student Research Network in the School of Arts, English and Languages here at Queen's. So thank you very much, Jordan.
Thank you so much, Alison. Again, as I've said all along so far today, thank you for all your work in putting this event together. So this is our third panel of the day, and we're talking about British and Irish postdoctoral schemes, and we'll get straight into it, I think. So I'll introduce our first panelist. So our first panelist is Dr. Noreen Massoud. Following a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship at Durham, Noreen Massoud became a lecturer in 20th century literature at the University of Bristol in January 2022, working on aphorism, flatness and nonsense. Her book on Stevie Smith and aphorism comes out this year, and her memoir travelogue on flat landscapes comes out with Penguin in 2023. And today she'll be speaking to us about the Leverhulme Trust, the postdoctoral scheme there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison, for organising this extraordinary day that I wish I'd had earlier in my ECR career. And thank you very much, everyone, for coming. So I'm here to talk about the Leverhulme Early Career Fellowships. I can also talk briefly, if it's of use to anyone, about the IRC GOIPD scheme, which is, and Stephen's going to talk more about the IRC, but I think a different strand of the scheme. So yeah, I'll mostly be talking about the Leverhulme Fellowship though, and at some point I'll bring my application up and sort of talk that through. Worth saying at this point that I am happy to share both my Leverhulme Fellowship application and my IRC postdoctoral application with anyone who is interested. You just email me or tweet me and I'll send it over. Okay, so I started my PhD in 2014. I submitted it in 2017 and I vivaed in February 2018. And I then started my Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship in November 2018. So I was applying for fellowships in the last year of my PhD, alongside, you know, the horror of finishing the PhD and teaching and so on. I think the first thing I want to acknowledge is that it is not a fun process. It is a horror, you know, if you are hating it, if you are just mired in horror with it, I think that's a completely normal and proportionate response. It's dire. It really, you constantly have to advocate for yourself and for your work is not an easy experience. So I just, yeah, if you're having a horrible time, I just want to let you know that you're not alone and they're just horrible things to have to do, horrible applications to have to fill out. So yes, I started applying for fellowships in the third year of my doctorate, and I already felt like I was kind of behind, and that was, it turned out to not be the case, not by a long shot. You know, I my CV wasn't particularly brilliant either. I think I had one article out at the time. I'll bring it up and can show you. And I felt at first that, yes, I was quite behind in the whole sort of situation. The main thing that was sort of on the cards for applications when in my cohort that felt like a thing that people talked about was the Oxford and Cambridge Junior Research Fellowships. There was much less conversation about other kinds of postdoc, and I didn't know how to apply for them at all. I didn't know anything about them. I felt very much at sea. So I started applying for these JRFs, these Junior Research Fellowships, I think in autumn 2017. So as I was finishing the PhD, pre-hand-in, and I just got universally rejected, not longlisted for anything, not shortlisted for anything, just straight out, flat rejected. And I did keep, I kept sort of trying, and all of these fellowships have different sort of lengths, different sort of word counts for various things. And I rewrote every application before I submitted. And gradually over time, by the end of it, I got 3 interviews for postdocs, for junior research fellowships. I think it was 2 at Oxford, 1 at Cambridge, and I got rejected for all of them as well. Yeah, a lot of postdocs are odd. The JRFs particularly are sort of odd birds, I think. But I think there is something to be said there about, I don't know, I certainly found that the applications I was writing at the end of the process were just fundamentally different from the ones I was writing at the beginning. Like, I learned so much from the process of being constantly rejected. The main thing I think I learned through that process was I really internalized the fact that, unlike my PhD supervisor, no one reading my application was under any obligation to be engaged with it. So if it was boring, if it wasn't grabbing people's attention, if it wasn't immediately obvious why they should fund me, it was going in the bin. And my first several applications, none of that was obvious at all. They were written as though I were writing for an examiner rather than a colleague or a reader. And it's an examiner's job to figure out whether your work meets the rubric, to spend time with it, to give it the benefit of the doubt, but the reader's only job is to be interested or not interested. So that, for me, was quite a helpful shift to think of it in terms of writing for someone who had the choice to be interested or not. So the reason I applied for all of these JRFs, and I applied for the Leverhulme, which was a sort of, not a very well supported thing to do at my institution at that time in that department. And I didn't apply for the British Academy postdoc. And I think it's still the case that you can only apply once for the British Academy postdoc with the same sort of research project. And I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll apply for the Leverhulme and I'll get rejected, but then I'll use that rejected feedback to feed into a BA application, and then I'll be better prepared for my one shot. And in the end, I didn't need to do that because I got accepted for the Leverhulme. So I did my doctorate at Oxford, and I applied to Durham for the Leverhulme for a few reasons. Partly, I thought that mobility would be a good idea. It'd be good to go to university, good to go elsewhere than the place I'd done my doctorate. Also, there was somebody at Durham who, so my postdoc was on flat landscapes and the way they make us feel in literature. And there was somebody at Durham who worked on mountains in modernist literature. So I thought, that's a good match. And also, I just wanted to be close to my family who live in Scotland. So there were several reasons for the shift. And I think that wanting to be close to family is as valid a reason as any other to make these decisions. You have to know where you're going to be happy. So as I say, I was very sort of underprepared to know how to do this. So I was on Twitter. I mean, that was the way that I knew of the member of staff at Durham who worked on modernist landscapes. And I knew this may be somebody who would be a good person to know. So the first contact I made with the person who would be my future mentor was when I was doing a teaching qualification, and I part of the qualification was that you had to critique someone else's course. So I wrote to her and said, I see you teach this amazing course on mountains and modernist literature. Could I critique it, please, for my teaching portfolio? And so that was our first contact. She sent me the course and I critiqued it and submitted it. And then I wrote to her a little bit later saying, I'm thinking of applying for a Leverhulme. How would you feel about being my mentor? And I attached my CV, and I attached the kind of rough 500-word proposal draft I'd written, very, very rough, and would undergo vast changes between then and the end of the process. And she said, no, that looks like something I'd be interested in. Here are some changes I'd like you to make. And there is a set of internal deadlines that you need to know. This is an important thing whenever you're applying for something like, well, I think for most postdocs, there's the external deadline, like in this case, Leverhulme's own deadline. But then there are internal deadlines that you have to meet within the institution for which you're applying. There's either one or two. It depends on the institution. I don't know if any have three, but of course there might be. And in this case, so the Leverhulme's deadline was, I think, in March. The first internal deadline that I had to meet was the 5th of January. And I think then the next one was either late January or early February. I can't remember now. So for the first stage, for that first internal deadline, I just sort of got up an old copy of the Leverhulme's form and kind of mocked up answers to all of the questions in it and put that in a Word document and sent it off. And it was passed through. And for the next stage, you get, I got feedback from the department and the faculty. And then I had to feed that in for the next round of applications, which was a next round of sort of internal deadlines at the end of that month. And then I got more feedback from it. And then it went in again, as I say, kind of February, March time. And I got my answer about that in May. So it was quite a long process. And I think I started thinking about it. I would say I started really putting my back into thinking about it in kind of November 2017 for an application that went through in February, March time, and that gave you the result in May. And again, the draft I started with and what I ended up with, unrecognizable. Yeah. The most important thing that I think I learned from this long process of being rejected and showing and rewriting the application. When I think back on that year, the main thing that I remember is just endlessly rewriting. The Leverhulme's word limit, well, they have a kind of page limit, or they did when I was applying. It was that it has to fit onto 2 sides of A4 paper. And I just learned, I'm spending all my time learning the tricks of fitting things onto a sheet of paper. This has nothing to do with research. It turns out it is one of the main bits of writing research applications is trying to make it fit in a completely arbitrary space. Yeah, but the biggest thing that I learned that I think helped with my application in the end was this sense that it is your responsibility to be interesting, that it's not their responsibility to be interested in you. They are looking for reasons to say no. It's your responsibility to be interesting. And part of that is showing why your research matters, not just to people in your subfield, not just to people in your field, but also to people outside the academy. Again, I don't know if this is still the case, but when I was applying, I was told that many of the people who make the decisions in the Leverhulme are people from business, not from the academy at all. And I think many ways with sort of like daily lives, which don't involve reading research in the way that we do in any capacity, business people. So it's really the sense that everything I said had to be linked to broader questions about why it mattered and broader kind of contemporary issues. That felt like it was very important. And I had a wonderful mentor for this. And it was a completely informal thing. She was just somebody who was in my department who sat down and had a coffee with me, made me talk through my research, and at every point said to me, why does that matter? Why should I care about that? So what? And the process of finding answers for this, even when the answers felt like a little bit of a stretch or arbitrary, that really helped me think through how my research appeared to somebody who wasn't embroiled in it in the way that I was, that my supervisor was, that other PhD students around me were. So for instance, I was working on flat landscapes, and in the end, what we sort of like fumbled our way towards is that this, flat landscape says something about emptiness or spaces in which nothing's happening, and why those might be important. They might link to landscapes of waste, landscapes that have been like drained or demolished. So they link to all of these kind of bigger questions about loss and memory and absence, which are potentially of interest, or at least hook onto something that people can kind of understand or relate to outside your field. I think one thing that's really important is find the people who are willing to do that for you. And again, it can be just the people you know who are good at asking questions, who are good at asking good questions. Speak to PhD students in other fields. Speak to people who aren't in the academy but are interested and engaged. Get them to read your application and tell you where they lost interest. What was the point at which they felt even a little bit lost or a little bit, adrift? And I think the best, it's really important to be ready to be interested in their answers. I think we can get to such a feeling, certainly I could, and I did, and I do get to such a stage of feeling that I've got my back up against a wall, that I'm under threat or attack. But actually when one is precarious, that feeling is so awful. It's just chronic. The more that one is able to feel curious rather than defensive about that kind of feedback, the easier it becomes. But I'm aware that's a really tall order. It's easier for some subject positions than for people in others. But it was just something I felt really helpful to kind of keep in my mind and focus on as a way of coping. Just trying to think of, so one of the questions I get asked sometimes is how did I choose the topic for a 3-year postdoc where I'm sort of not related to anyone else's project and I'm just kind of working independently. What it looked like for me is that my thesis was on aphorism in the poet Stevie Smith. And I became interested in the way that the aphorism says something flatly, like it just says a statement, that's it, there's nothing more to say. And my PhD and my forthcoming book are in various ways about that, about kind of aphorism as withdrawing from conversation and not wanting to, saying something and not wanting an answer. But it made me interested in the idea of flatness and why the term flat can be kind of double-edged, like it's something which is, when a space is flat, it's often thought of as empty, but also when we say something flatly, there's such fullness in that. There's such emphasis when you say something flatly. So saying something was full and empty at the same time, and that was interesting to me. So I had a chapter in my thesis about that, which I cut out when I turned my thesis into a book. But then I thought, this is the bit of my thesis which could springboard into a whole new book. So that's what I said. I said, I'm going to write about flatness. I'm going to write about flatness in different authors. At this particular time, it's going to become a multi-author project rather than the single author project that my PhD was. So that was how I chose it. And there might be a bit in your theses or side projects which you just feel, actually, there's more scope in this. I can run a bit further with that. That's how I chose what to do. Okay, so this is a redacted version of my Leverhulme application that I submitted in 2018. So you can see they have these sort of strange little short answer questions, or again, they did when I was applying at the time. And the one I found actually hardest to write was this little abstract, because it's so short. I think it was something like, was it 150, 200 words, something like that, something ludicrously short. And I rewrote the first sentences so many times. And again, it's what it came down to was starting with a big question that was written in very simple language and people could immediately understand what was going on. And then kind of like zooming outwards to bigger questions. As I say, I'm really happy to share this application with anyone who's interested. This is what my research proposal looked like. So again, it was about, I had this whole section I labeled context. And again, it was about starting with a hook, starting with a good quotation in this sense. This great quotation from Stevie Smith. I like this flatness, I feel at home in it. So then I sort of narrated doing my DPhil and how I became interested in flatness and then what I wanted to go on to kind of develop from that. It's also worth saying that this what I've outlined here, it bears almost no relationship to the monograph draft as it currently stands. It will change so much, but the important thing is it sounds credible at this stage. And this was all research that I hadn't done yet, so I was frantically kind of reading other books just to kind of be able to put them in the research proposal to show that I knew the field, but equally, again, it's only ever going to be a provisional or contingent knowledge, so you just have to start somewhere. And again, sort of the wider context in which the work sat, and the kind of like metaphorical resonances of flatness, as well as literal flatness. Now, again, so I was instructed to kind of break things down, to be really granular, to have a section on aims and objectives, a section on methodology. And if you're applying for the IRC GOIPD fellowship, incidentally, that is also something that's really, really emphasized, is kind of fake science ways of structuring and thinking about work. Often they'll think of, so here you can see in my methodology, I've got phases. Phase one, I've got, so in this phase of time, these are the dates, these are the questions I'll be asking, what's the output going to be? And it's also worth saying that not all Lever Human fellowships look like this, but it is maybe worth saying that, and there are different successful ones with different formats, but I think if you start getting used to maybe to thinking in this way about like dividing things into phases or work packages, it's increasingly what is asked of you. So there's no harm, I think, in sort of doing the thought experiment, even if you don't follow it all the way through. So yeah, it goes all the way up to 6 phases, and then I had a little box on outcomes. And again, don't overpromise. Don't overpromise. The most you could promise is having a rough draft of the whole thing. You might even be more specific and say that I'll have a rough draft of half of it and one polished chapter. They don't want to know that it's that you're going to like pull a book out of a hat in 3 years. They want to know that you're somebody who knows how long research takes and has made an ambitious but credible promise to them. Because if you make one that's impossible, you're just going to break it, and they know that. So yeah, that's my application. Happy to share it with anyone, and really sorry for going over time. I'll pass on now, I think, and happy to answer any questions in the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much for that, for so much information and so many things to think about. So we really appreciate that. So the next speaker on this panel is Dr. Stephen O'Neill. Stephen is an Irish Research Council Enterprise Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the School of English at Trinity College Dublin and the Irish Museum of Modern Art. Previously, he was a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow for the Keogh Naughton Institute for Irish Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He has also held short-term visiting fellowships at NUI Galway and at the University of Sao Paulo. His first book, Irish Culture and Partition, 1920 to 1955, is forthcoming with Liverpool University Press. And today he'll be talking to us about the Irish Research Council Enterprise Scheme.
So thank you very much, Jordan, and to Alison as well. I wanted to start this just by saying how grateful I've been for Alison's sort of support over the past couple of years, and how it's great this has been formalized as a kind of mass event of some sort. Every application that I've done really has either drawn upon something that she shared with me, and many other friends, but particularly Alison shared with me, and I'm very happy to repay the favour in this way. And like Noreen as well, incredibly happy to share anything if it might be useful to anybody, or to give whatever advice might be needed for this. So as Jordan just said, I'm an Irish Research Council Enterprise Postdoctoral Fellowship, which at Trinity and at the Irish Museum of Modern Art. Previously, I was actually at the University of Notre Dame, as Jordan said as well. So I have an experience of the kind of, research performing institute, as it's called, or university only research fellowship. So the transition has been quite interesting. Quite interesting just in terms of what, how research changes in that particular environment. What I'm going to talk today about really is the kind of specifics of the IRC application, which is kind of performs a double function because it's quite similar to the IRC application that Noreen mentioned, which is the GPOID, I think, which is the kind of research, solely research-based in a research institution, a fellowship. The enterprise one is very technical in terms of what it actually defines as collaboration between a university and an enterprise fellow, or enterprise partner, sorry, as it is called. So I thought defining that might be useful for someone who's looking to apply to these things. I think often with the kind of applications between a university and between enterprise or NGOs, etc., as we'll get to defining, often there's very particular stipulations about what these are. So I thought going through those with the IRC and maybe looking at how to identify one of those might be useful I thought would be the best possible contribution I could give. So this is my enterprise partner, as I frequently call it, the Irish Museum of Modern Art, as you can see on the left. So here I'm the enterprise fellow for this year and for the next academic year. During this time, I'm based at the School of English in Trinity, where I'm finishing my book project on Irish culture and partition under the mentorship of Tom Walker. But I'm also working, at least half the time with Emma, with Lisa Moran and the Engagement and Learning Department to develop a series of events. These events are conceived really within essentially commemoration, which is a kind of buzzword in Ireland at the minute, given the kind of centenaries that are happening. But I'm particularly concerned in my own work, of course, with partition, but I'm looking with Emma at other commemorations as well. What the form that this takes is essentially research seminars in-house, but also we're organising a major international conference, contributing panels to the summer school, which is happening this and next year, and also developing a reading group. On top of that, also quite excitingly, I'm at least suggesting some objects and some paintings, etc., to curate for the museum as well for an international exhibition. So I'm involved in quite a lot of the processes in a very sort of almost a sort of a consulting with kind of my research way in terms of major kind of curatorial projects. But my main focus is really organising events and researching for these events as well. So it's also what's also interesting with this, I suppose, particularly the people who would have been familiar with my background before, is that I have absolutely no formal training, at least in art history, and that's one of the reasons why this particular scheme had an appeal to me. To work in somewhere like an art gallery or a museum is not something I particularly had any kind of idea that I could do, and these enterprise schemes actually in certain institutions allow you to do that. So I think that's something I think would at least, if you were looking to expand your horizons, I don't think you should only just work in a library if you do entirely English literature, for example. So for example, my research has previously focused on Anglophone Irish writing and its connections to the history of Ireland, and I kind of began to develop an interest in visual culture, particularly towards kind of representations of art and visual culture in the period. And so this enterprise fellowship came something as a surprise, really, that I could apply for at an important time in research as well, when I started kind of thinking about different things and thinking about the visual and thinking about the commemoration in Ireland. The aims of the scheme are quite important, just in terms of how it's being branded essentially, and I think also in terms of what that would be useful for, in terms of how you might apply to this and the kind of person who might apply to this. So as it says here, it's a unique national initiative linking excellent researchers in all disciplines to enterprise. It provides researchers with the opportunity to pursue research in collaboration with enterprise while based at an eligible higher education or research performing institution. Now, these are obviously just means generally universities, but could also mean, of course, a research institute, which is separate from that. And through this co-funded program, researchers develop new advanced knowledge and skills linked with industry and employer needs. The program trains early career researchers for the diversity of employment opportunities in industry, the public sector, and the non-government sectors. So, as with all of these applications, but particularly with applications geared towards industries, whatever they might be, there is quite technical language in terms of what qualifies for that. But the general aims of the scheme, I think, are to bring research and research skills beyond the university and into kind of public and private sectors, and in some ways maybe formalizing that engagement that your research might have had in a more kind of, well, you get paid for it essentially way. The aims are obviously quite broad here, and they're quite, they're obviously announced by a government body. So trying to find out what the general idea is, it might be quite hard, but I think it's mutually developing kind of sharing knowledge between skills, mutually developing skills and I think knowledge between universities and enterprises, as well as develop kind of obviously for the researchers' purpose, employability in sectors beyond academia. So again, a mutually beneficial process, but also a collaboration. There are some important particulars of this fellowship in that it's essentially employed in the same way as the Government of Ireland Postdoctoral Fellowship Programme that Noreen mentioned, but with a significant contribution from the enterprise. So it's a full-time position for 24 months. It entails a salary of around about €40,000 per year, with a slight increase, obviously, in the second year. There are research expenses of €5,000 per year as well, which can obviously translate into either year, or you can move these about if needs be. And also, of course, these stipulations about what a university and what an enterprise partner is. The really important part about choosing and even courting an enterprise partner is that they have to contribute a substantial amount to this. So there are particular ways of going about this, and one of the things that you need to know, of course, is what exactly an enterprise partner is, which might not roll off the tongue as such. So it can be a company, registered charity, social, cultural, not-for-profit civic organization, a state-owned enterprise, or an eligible public body who will obviously seek to co-fund the researcher for the duration of this award. It's also a public service body with specific scientific or cultural infrastructure that is integral to the conduct and completion of proposed research. Sorry, that's specifically for the sort of public body itself. The important thing is, really for humanities research, I suppose, which is the only thing I could really talk about, is that it can be a museum, a library, a charity, or basically whoever is willing to fund you. My advice on this would be that the enterprise partner will generally know, but helpfully on the IRC website, they also list examples of these. So this seems to be, I think, quite scientific heavy in terms of, there's even like a science gallery here, but also in terms of, the sort of biotech experience and sort of cancer research, etc., the kind of things we'd be familiar with in terms of collaborations with academia and with industry as well. But what you can also see here is, this is from last year's kind of list of potential partners, that there's also Marsh's Library and the Arts Council. So who you're actually going to approach is important, and understanding what you might want to, or the kind of organization that will be able to kind of host this and to kind of fund it as well is important. And I'll get to how you might be able to do that in a second. But also it's important to think about who can apply and the general guidelines given here. In the IRC, again, it's important to look at the technicalities of these before really talking about how you kind of navigate these. It's obviously a way of developing your CV for outside roles, but what's generally been said here is that you have to have a PhD awarded within 5 years. So it's generally looking for freshly like minted PhDs, or however like the IRC defines an early career researcher as it does. There's also the important caveat that you cannot have been unsuccessful to the scheme twice before. So much like the original kind of the standard, if you like, a Government of Ireland Research Fellowship, you only get 2 chances to submit. But significantly, of course, you also can submit after having 2 failed applications, as I actually did as well. So I didn't get the IRC postdoctoral fellowship based solely in UCD in my case, 2 years in a row. So I was able to apply for this. So it's even an alternative in some ways to that. But of course, you will have to change your application in a particular way to suit the needs of, in my case, Emma. The other thing to point out is that with all of these kind of what seem to be very strict kind of delineations of what are and aren't research institutes or aren't enterprise bodies, this is obviously like a way of developing your CV for outside roles, but I don't think it's necessarily the end of your academic career either. I don't think that you necessarily have to sort of quit academia to do this particular scheme. And I think all of what happens afterwards and what happens, of course, during it depends on your research body and on your enterprise partner. So the paths afterwards can be fairly flexible. And I personally know at least 2 people who have went on to academic research roles afterwards as well. But I think, obviously the overarching aims and intentions of the scheme are important to note here as well. So it's also important, I think, to think about how to apply. And Noreen was really talking about the kind of effort of redrafting and thinking about your reader, which is really important. And all that obviously entails a massive time commitment. And particularly for the Irish Research Council stuff, as it is with other ones like the British Academy and the Marie Curie, there is obviously a huge time commitment involved here, and there's specifically listed set of deadlines that you have to, that generally recur each year. By the way, these deadlines more or less kind of tessellate with the deadlines for 2020 when I applied. These are the deadlines for the scheme that sort of ended, or just the deadline was in December of last year. As you can see, the call only opens in October. And then finishes or the deadline is in the 2nd of December. But the important thing to think about here is like you need to basically find someone almost, within 4 or 5 months, because it's such a big kind of commitment to find that enterprise research partner. But also that your mentors know what the story is, that your referees, of course, all these things. It's an incredibly time-consuming process, as I'll get into in a second. And having an idea of the deadlines is really important, but also that these deadlines will probably be the same next year. and the IRC should announce them at some point in the near, well, some point with indicative deadlines in the summer. So I would keep an eye on all of that, both for this actually and for the research only sort of scheme. I also thought it would be important here is kind of how to apply. There was a very comprehensive talk about this from Katie Mishler last year, a good friend of mine who's doing one of these schemes between Molly and UCD. And Katie, I think, essentially created her own one, which I don't think I would have had the ability to do. But what was quite fortunate in my case, as I'll get into later, is that I was able to actually just go to the website and see potential enterprise and employment partners. So this is what the website looks like. And as you can see on the right-hand side, there are all this really important call documentation and really kind of, a lot of it FAQs, things that are really telling you exactly what to say and what to do. But the most important part for this particular fellowship is this organization's interest in funding researchers. So what this is an Excel document which has, basically listed organization names, websites, themes and research areas, as well as whether they're looking for master's, PhD or postdoctoral scholars. It'll have a contact, which I've obviously removed from this. It'll have a contact detail for people who or you have to apply to or to express your interest to. But it also will have, a general idea of further things that they might be interested in as well, as you can see, sort of to the slide that's kind of cut off, the part that's cut off from the slide. For me, I didn't personally seek out an enterprise partner. These were listed here, which made the whole application process much easier and much more kind of user-friendly for me, but also because my research area is kind of tested with what Emma were looking to do, which was namely to look at the kind of period 1920 and look at kind of cultural representation in that period. But I wouldn't necessarily say that's the only way you can do this, as Katie has shown. I think what you can also do is think about the kind of themes and research areas that are in, like say it says Marsh's Library here, for example, interested in sort of links between France and Ireland and Huguenots. If there's a similar organization that you have contacts with, again, a bit like Noreen was saying in terms of someone she'd contacted before for a review, if there's someone who's working in one of these institutions or anything like that, you can sort of like gauge interest. And I would do it, if I was applying this year, I would do it as soon as possible. Gauge interest for one of these applications. Again, when I say it's a time-consuming process, it's pretty time-consuming for them as well as obviously meaning that you're going to have to work there, they're going to have to sort of cater for you in some way as well, and that these kind of like the research costs or whatever the kind of third of the research money that they contribute is going to be much more in terms of time and effort as well. So the application form is something as well I thought I should flag at an early sort of part of this as well. It's all IRC application forms, postgraduate, postdoctoral, and even the kind of the update forms that you have to do once you get one of them are incredibly time consuming. They're very specific in terms of what they ask for, like all these things, but they also ask, in this case, for very particular information that you might not be able to do without the help of someone in terms of both your mentor and in terms of both of your mentor at your institution, your academic institution, as well as the mentor at the enterprise fellow. So the methodology, research schedule, related to the current research, etc., and specialist knowledge is all maybe familiar, but you then also have to justify your research environment, and that's a really important thing to think about when it comes to things like this. You have to like really think about what you're going to do for the next couple of years. You also will obviously have to think about whether you want to do it. But also that your training and career development plan will also have to include employability in these sectors. You'll have to think about like how that is going to play out whenever professionals are reading this, whenever people who are also researchers and professionals are reading this as well. Now, there's two ways of going about this essentially, and in terms of what you put first. If you have an academic mentor, who's a kind of ready-made one, as I did, you can essentially approach them and then approach whatever kind of enterprise partner that you want to kind of collaborate with. Otherwise, I think the best possible way to do it is maybe to look at what enterprise fellow or enterprise partner might want to fund this kind of research, and then to find the kind of mentor afterwards. The significant part about this is that in the normal IRC, you basically have to move. There has to be research mobility from your PhD institution, but with an enterprise partnership, you don't actually have to do that, which is quite useful for me, as I'll get to in a second. So part of what I think is maybe handy to think about here is what my CV looked like before I applied, because often it's hard to think about you know, applying for these things without knowing what you kind of need to apply for. When I applied in the autumn of 2020, I had sort of just recently finished a postdoctoral position at Notre Dame in the United States, but I'd also finished my PhD in English at Trinity as well. And so I was a couple of years out at this stage and had a kind of decent amount of research experience. And so part of the application was also thinking about maybe what my research experience can be, what can I build upon apart from research experience, what can I bring also to IMA. So it also held a number of visiting fellowships in various places as well. So mobility wasn't really, I suppose, an issue in some ways. With these positions also came a decent record of funding for my stage, with awards from like the IRC as well as the National Endowment of Humanities, and a number of other smaller grants from individual institutions and schemes. In terms of publications, I mean, in general, I just signed a monograph contract and had about 3 or 4 book chapters either published or in print. I was co-editing a journal special issue, and I also had a number of outward-facing blog posts and articles for newspaper media websites. I think in the application, it was important to show both sides of this publication record for me, because I was looking at a sort of public-facing and outward-facing institution, alongside, you know, the enterprise partner and the kind of and Trinity, sorry. And so they're primarily interested, I suppose, in the public-facing elements of the role. And I'm sure this might differ from institution to institution, but I was pretty keen to look at kind of stuff that I'd done, like conferences that I'd organized, networks that I kind of built up, and kind of the kind of open access blog posts, etc., the kind of public engagement things that, you know, we do, and don't really seem to count for much, I think, in an academic CV, as they're called, but might actually count for something when you're looking at these kind of like outward facing roles. One of the reasons, I suppose, that I went for this particular fellowship was that since I'd already undertaken a postdoc in Notre Dame, which was kind of cut short in the pandemic, I was sort of waiting to see at the time as well if I was going to be able to do a short-term a short-term Huntington fellowship at Trinity as well. So this appealed to me at the time because it happened at a time when I was in transition. Essentially, I'd been rejected for quite a lot of things as well, but also that I wasn't particularly close, I think, to getting the IRC research scholarship either. As the kind of list of rejections is sort of shown here, I'd applied for quite a lot of things and wasn't able to get them. And I think I probably needed to think about other ways my research might be useful as well. The draw for me was also not only to return to Trinity, but also to work at an institution like IMA, and particularly since they were interested in beginning conversations about commemoration with the aid of my research. And I didn't really need to start again in a particular way, but I could actually redirect my conversations to different audiences and to different people, and to think about like what this might mean for a broader audience as well. For me, just to sort of finally talk about the application process, it was quite simple in a sense, because everybody was so kind of helpful and so on board with the project itself. But since the call was listed on the website, as I just shown you, as it is every year, it should be as well, I was able to just contact a very specific person at IMA who was their point person for dealing with a particular scheme. So I didn't need to sort of build my own job. As such, the Irish Museum of Modern Art had already put out a call for expressive interest on the website in a similar kind of document to the one that I just shown you. So since I was tasked with sort of completing the monograph project as well, I was able to kind of just go straight back into Trinity, and so it was quite an easy fit for me in that way as well. And one of the major benefits of this scheme, again, is the fact that you don't need to kind of move. Aside from having a supervisor who I kind of trusted and someone who, and an institution, which I'd already been at, it kind of mitigated the difficulties of having to go between two different and new institutions to me. So that's one of the reasons why it's a particularly important. It was, but also that I was drawing upon past experience of enterprise postdoctorates at Trinity, particularly actually with IMA as well. There was someone who had done an application in Trinity, and who had basically was able to share the application, which was quite technical and specific, with me as well. And I had other friends who worked in Molly and in the Huntington Library as well. So from then on, as I say, the application was somewhat similar to the research only IRC one, which most people approach with, I think, an understandable sense of dread. But since I'd already actually completed the two applications and had been unsuccessful, the pro forma is generally the same as it is and it ended up being a fairly straightforward process completely. I don't want to really say too much else other than that it's been an incredibly beneficial process to put my research in conversations with new researchers that really I'm not necessarily sure about the idea of like using this as a kind of transitional thing. There's so many different ways that you can approach this. You can do it in a way which you're essentially trying to broaden your audience and to think about your publics. There are plenty of academics that are writing books and trade books for a wider audience, and I know that Maurice Casey is going to talk about this tomorrow as well. But that you can basically build your own postdoc in the sense of not only maybe starting a new career, but also thinking about the publics that you're working with. And also, I think if you're doing particularly cutting edge or kind of different research, that you might want to tailor it towards this particular scheme, simply because that might be the best fit outside of the academy as well. But just to kind of foreground that it doesn't necessarily mean that you're kind of leaving academia as a result, and you don't have to sort of, as part of the application process, you don't have to pen a resignation letter. I'd be very happy both to share things with anyone who would want advice or applications, but also to answer any questions, because I probably haven't answered any of those in your head. So thank you very much for listening.
That's great. Thank you so much, Stephen, for all of that. And I'm sure there will be plenty of questions, which we'll come to at the end, but brilliant, thank you. So we'll move straight to our third and final panelist in this session. And I will just introduce her now. So Dr. Rasika Ajotika is a British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow at the Department of Development Studies at SOAS, University of London. Her project examines issues of labour and gender as they relate to caste, class and hereditary artisanship, to explore the ways in which musicianship as a service has evolved into a performance art in modern India. Dr. Ajotika has worked as a postdoctoral fellow on a DFG, German Research Foundation project between 2017 and 2020 at the Department of Musicology in Göttingen, Germany, in collaboration with the Berliner Archivism. Dr. Ajotika's training in North Indian classical vocal music of over 2 decades has been central to her research. While critically engaging with the pedagogy and modern historiography of North Indian classical music, she has also been an active performer. Her research and performance have led to extensive collaborations with activists and musicians in India, and today she'll be sharing with us on the British Academy's postdoctoral scheme. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me here. I echo a lot of things that have already been said here by Noreen and Stephen. So thank you for everything that you shared. Let's see how much I can add to whatever that has already been said here. So I aim to speak for about 15-20 minutes. But if I go a little bit over, just let me know, and I can stop and we can take some questions in the Q&A. So I'm not really going to go through the information on the website of the British Academy Postdoctoral Fellowship. I'm sure many of you have already probably visited and seen all the information on it, but I'm going to speak about, I think, my particular experience being in music departments, and also working on multiple projects at the same time, and how being on the job market really looks like when you are in that position. So of course, my background is in the humanities, particularly music or ethnomusicology. So whatever I'll say will be more or less focused on that particular research, which is very close to anthropology. Yeah. So I graduated actually until my master's. I was in India. So I did my master's in anthropology in India and then went to SOAS for a PhD. And I was in the Felix Scholarship then, which fully funds a 3-year full-time PhD. So which meant that I was funded from 2014 to 2017 at SOAS. And in 2017, I quickly realized that I'm probably not going to finish my thesis. And so I had to look for either live in London and take up several jobs or apply for different possibilities in Europe and see what happens. And so that's when actually I got what they call in Germany a pre-doc position. And so I took that at the University of Göttingen in the music department. And that was also a 3-year position during which I was supposed to finish my thesis And I did, and I defended in 2000. Well, I submitted my draft in 2018 and had my viva in January of 2019. And I did get a couple of corrections, and it took a few months to submit them. So I essentially finished in 2019. And so between the time that I handed in my draft and after my viva, that was the time that I started to apply for different positions. And actually, I was not only applying for early career research fellowships, but also lectureships and assistant professorships really across the Anglo-American world. So I think I was kind of familiar with a few academic systems as to what kind of applications are expected and so on. But I think the British Academy came about because of my, rather through my PhD viva experience. So this was kind of a unique case because my internal examiner during my viva is currently my mentor, my BA mentor. And so she was the one who had been very interested in my work. And she'd also sort of arranged for me to perform several times at SOAS. And she was the one who sort of encouraged me to apply for different fellowships, one of which was the BA. So yeah, I could just sort of go through some of the questions that already Noreen and Stephen have answered, but I'm sorry for the repetition, but maybe I could just go through a few things particular to the BA. Yes, so I mean, when I said earlier, I started preparing my applications between the time that I handed in my draft and through my viva and after. That meant, as Stephen said, it takes a lot of time. It took me a full year to actually list all the potential fellowships and so on, and create sort of almost an Excel sheet of deadlines and so on. And so, yeah, you do end up applying for 20, 25 odd fellowships or job applications. That might be even a small number, in fact. And yes, I did get quite a few rejections from many postdocs in the UK, also some lectureships in the UK. And that sort of was what was kind of expected, because most people who had recently graduated and applied for similar fellowships had indicated that that would happen. But how, I think the way I started to think about sort of applying for the BA was also to think about what my CV would look like. And on some level, I was already working on 2 projects. So there were already things in the pipeline. So thinking about publications, at the same time, attending conferences and presenting papers there, and sometimes combining both, and thinking about conference papers as potential journal articles was sort of a good idea. But also, I mean, for the most part, of course, research and funds and all of that is an important part of the CV. And I could actually share my screen later to just show how my CV looked like before I applied for the BA. But mostly how the research really, like why are we interested in the research that we do, and how it speaks to contemporary concerns. And that was sort of my focus really. And like Noreen said, what is interesting about our project that this particular funding body would give us money. So I did prepare like 2 to 3 projects, just research projects that could be potentially turned into a BA application. Or later on, I also applied for the Newton Fellowship, in fact, which also, I mean, I didn't have to wait for it because I got the BA first. So that was that. But yes, it's really important to have 2 to 3 projects sort of prepared, or maybe a draft of 2, 3 research projects that you would have in mind, so that they could potentially be turned into an application. And of course, I mean, I think this is a really important point about choosing an institution or a mentor. And I mean, a postdoc is like, I would describe it as a more, and it may be different, of course, for everyone, but it could be a more lonely process than the PhD, because you're really on your own and you do have your own, you're running your own project essentially. So it's really important what kind of community, what kind of department you want to be in, where do you want to live, etc. But at the same time, it's also really important to know who you're going to work with, who's your mentor, and what is their work like. In my case, I happened to know my mentor beforehand, and I was familiar with her work. So it was, I think, slightly easier for me to approach her and get her help on not just the application, but generally thinking about post-PhD life. At the same time, I would also just say there's no need to be afraid about which department sort of works for you, because of course most research is interdisciplinary, and a lot of times what we end up doing in our research doesn't fit into one single department, but it often is sort of an administrative category depending on which department excuse me, your mentor is based in. So I think those kinds of things are really interesting when you search for a potential mentor. So which department would you look into, and what kind of research interests would you want to sort of pursue, and how those intersect with the mentor and the departments and so on. So it's not as straightforward as it may look on the websites and so on, because that's the only sort of access these days to get to know people. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I would say with the BA in particular, there's of course a very elaborate, there are very elaborate guidelines for the application, and I urge you all to like read it very, very carefully. And I think the eligibility criteria and all of that is like, all of those things are really important. But also go through the application process, because they also keep changing every year. And as far as I'm aware, since the pandemic, they've changed or they've made it slightly more flexible, I think, for the applicants. Although it's quite competitive, I would still say like, keep reading all the guidelines as much as you possibly can when you start applying for the BA. Like I said, yes, I applied for the BA. I mean, for several reasons. Of course, it offered longer years. There were some other early career fellowships, which lasted only 2 years, some only for a year. And this seemed like, of course, the best option, one of the best options. Also, BA offers a lot of flexibility around how you would go ahead with your research. If you want to take breaks, if you want to be flexible with the way you proceed with your plans with regards to fieldwork or publishing or whatever it is. Yeah, I mean, and of course the most important was, of course, that I wanted to do research and take forward my PhD research and turn it into a book. And it's really kind of difficult to manage that, even based on my experience in Germany. While you're teaching and working on another project, it's really difficult to focus on writing and actually sitting and writing a chapter or a book or whatever it is. So having that research time is really, really absolutely crucial, especially for those of you who are willing to turn your PhD into a book sort of immediately in the few years after your PhD. Okay. Yeah, I think I can say a lot about visa applications. Um, but maybe I can speak about BA first and then come to immigration and visa and so on at the end. So for the BA, there were no interviews really, but the application has to go through 2 stages. And the first stage application is quite elaborate, and you have to, I think, you have to familiarize yourself with the Flexi grant system. So you don't really upload any documents as such, but you enter into the system itself. And there are there's a specific word limit for every section, and you have to stick to that. Yeah, and I think the second stage in the BA application usually is more concerned with how you plan to use your research budget and so on. So actually the first stage itself is really, really crucial. And I could actually, again, I could share, of course, my application, but I can also share my screen just to go through the application and see how it looks. Yeah, another thing is that in addition to internal deadlines for each institution, there also is who would be called a research excellence officer or a research development officer who should be ideally actively involved in your application process. And this is the person who thinks about the university's benefit in getting a British Academy fellow or any fellow for that matter, but also to really help you like write this application. And this is in addition to your mentor, like potential mentor. So of course, my mentor was actively involved in my application, and we were exchanging drafts for quite a few months before the deadline. But of course, the research officer at SOAS was also very actively involved in what would be expected in this application. And in fact, he also happened to share some previous successful applications with me. So that's really, really crucial. And I couldn't stress enough sharing your draft with the people who will actually give you critical feedback. I think that's really, really important. And also to give your draft to people who may not be familiar at all with your field. And of course, there are, like Noreen said, it's not just experts in your own discipline who are going to read your application. So in some sense, it should also, your application and the language that you use in this application should reflect definitely your experience so far. But at the same time, it shouldn't be very jargony, and it shouldn't, at least that's my opinion. It could be controversial, and I'm happy to talk about it later, but it's always difficult, I think, to write in simple and straightforward language. But I think that's really key, and to get some critical feedback even on that front from the mentor, but also from this research officer, if there is one assigned in your particular institution. Yeah, I think now I can come to the visa question and then just say a few things at the end and maybe share my screen. Yes, so I hold an Indian passport. So I'm an Indian citizen, which means that I have to get a visa every time I go to, well, I had to get 2 different visas for the UK and the Schengen visa where Germany is. And so depending on the category of work that you are to perform, you apply for different visa categories. And this is something for the UK. For the British Academy in particular, there is something called as a global talent visa, which is a tier 1, quite prestigious visa, I would say. I think it makes it easier also for you to get permanent residence in the UK. And there could be some other sort of sides to it, which I'm not currently aware of, but it's probably one of the most like easy visas for the UK in terms of work that you undertake in the country. So in addition to what I get paid, I can also work and get, I can also work basically as a freelancer. So those are the good sides of getting this visa, but it costs a fortune. And I had to struggle a lot to actually get SOAS to pay for the visa, because I think the visa application itself was a couple of £100. And then I had to also pay the medical surcharge, which was like £1,200, which was absolutely unbelievable. And I was working on a part-time job earlier, so I of course couldn't afford to pay all these fees. And actually, somebody who was working at the time at SOAS tried quite hard for me for SOAS to actually fund the visa, but actually it was quite difficult to get through that process then. And my department actually sort of sponsored my visa later. But it wasn't, actually that shouldn't be the case, because the institution should be responsible, because the institution does get a lot in the overdrafts of the fellowships that you apply for, especially the BA, I would say. And so they are responsible, or they should be responsible for your visas. And as far as I'm aware, about a year ago, after, along with me, a number of other people made some complaints around the visa issue. And now SOAS, I know that SOAS is taking this issue forward, and hopefully no one who comes to SOAS from here on has to pay for their visa, whether or not they are on the British Academy, to be honest. So that's sort of my 2 cents on the visa, and I can talk about this a little bit more later if there are any questions. Maybe I can stop here for now. I guess there's only 20 minutes left.
That would be great if that's okay, if you don't mind. We can people can ask you any more questions, and as we come to it, that would be
for sure. For sure. And I'm happy to also share my documents, whatever people feel like. Just get in touch with me, basically. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for that. Another really rich presentation. So thank you. I'll just invite all 3 of our panelists to put their cameras back on for me, and we will switch into the Q&A now at this point. So we've got plenty of questions coming in. Hopefully everyone can see the Q&A box. So I'll just work down through them in the order that they appear here, and try and connect some questions as we go through. So the first question is directly for Noreen. So you talked about mobility being desirable quality for funding applications. So this person did, sorry, Amber, apologies, I just glanced over your name. So Amber did her master's and is currently doing a PhD at the same institution, and she got accepted elsewhere, but the funding was better at the current institution. They've indicated that they'd like to keep her as a postdoc, but finding the funding is up to her. So do you think that might be an issue, and is there a way to reframe it in a positive sense?
Great question. It's worth saying that the only postdoc that mentioned mobility as a plus when I was applying was the Leverhulme. None of the other postdocs I applied to seemed to be troubled by that. With the Leverhulme, I would say that lots of people do stay at their institution, that they did their DPhil at or whatever. It's just a question of explaining why. You could say, well, the fit for my research doesn't exist anywhere else in the country, for instance. I mean, you have to have a narrative about it, and then it's fine. Usually they're like, fine, at least you've thought about mobility, you've ruled it out. So I don't think it's going to be too much of an issue. The other thing with the Leverhulme is that for the early stages of application, you are, or at least again when I applied, you were allowed, and I think you still are, allowed to apply to multiple places at the first stage of the application. Now, when it comes forward to putting your application through to the Leverhulme, you can only do so through one institution. So for instance, at the very beginning stage, you would have a mentor, say at Liverpool, and a mentor at Manchester, and you would apply to both of those initial internal rounds. And then, if say you got through to the final rounds with both of them, at that point, you'd choose your institution. So in your case, you could apply to your institution, see if you can get through that internal round, and then with another one as well. And yeah, when it comes down to that, see which you want to go with. Let me know if that doesn't answer your question.
Thanks so much for that. I wonder if we might link in with Paula's questions here that she has for us with regards to rejected applications, presuming then you're making multiple applications at once, and how you kind of bridge that with various different mentors, how open you are with regards to other institutions about the fact you're applying elsewhere, because that's a question that probably applies to everyone. So I wonder, maybe Stephen, because I'm assuming that she might be referring to your list that you gave us, maybe if you want to kick off and then others can jump in.
Yeah, I think, well, so obviously not all these at the same time. It's over like a period of maybe 3 or 4 years, and the whole thing about that is really that you do have to be, as if you really want a research career, then you need to apply for as many things as possible. It's the unfortunate part of it. I don't know anyone who hasn't got rejected. I think everyone would probably have said that over the past couple of years. I cannot for the life of me see anyone saying that they're getting annoyed in the environment of precarity that we're in, that you're actually applying to as many things as possible. I actually think it's really important that, like, if you're going to have someone who's there to understand what you're like, if you're going to have someone who's going to be your mentor, then they have to understand that you are going to be applying for as many things as possible. I would definitely say you would be, open about that, because, just to be open about it, but I can't see them having a problem with it. And if they do, then, they shouldn't, as far as I'm concerned, unless it's one of these things where they're applying, you have a particular relationship with them where like they want you to kind of apply for that, and they want to apply for numerous funding tranches for the same project. But no, I think you should apply to as many people and institutions as possible, obviously within reason, because these are very time consuming things as well. But as a mentor should not really worry about someone else applying. That's my opinion anyway. But
yeah, please, either of you would like to jump in as well, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, just seconding everything you said there, Stephen. Just yeah, anyone who gives you trouble about something like that is someone who I don't think would be a very good mentor.
Excellent, thank you so much. So I'm trying to group a few questions just because I'm conscious of time. So there's some questions about interdisciplinarity, and I wonder if we could link that with the question that's specifically to Stephen with regards to not having experience with art before, and seeing if we can kind of come up with a bit of a collaborative answer there. So maybe again, Stephen, if you don't mind kicking off specifically in your case, and then we'll broaden it out to more kind of interdisciplinary projects.
No problem. Specifically to Orla's question, it's interesting that Emma already had, like, Nathan O'Donnell and a few other people. I think even the incoming one might have been a graduate, PhD graduate School of English as well. So the School of English has a very odd relationship, very good productive relationship with Emma in terms of postdoctoral stuff. The IRC obviously, they're interested really in interdisciplinarity. Sorry, I should have been able to pronounce that the amount of times I put it in the application form at this stage. But they are interested in interdisciplinarity. If for Emma, it wasn't really a problem. I did foregrounded as an Irish studies thing. That's kind of where my research is going anyway. And I worked in a Irish studies department, so that was kind of fine. But in terms of segueing to different adjacent fields, I think the IRC are probably like completely fine with that, especially for an enterprise project. Now for a postdoctoral one, I'm sure Noreen might be able to speak about this as well, but I think they also want to see you engaging with other fields and not to be siloed. And I do think that's probably actually one of the difficulties of some of these forums, is that they ask for your research to have as much relevance as possible, to the point where, like me, I could be all things to all people in certain ways. So I think that's a really important question about the idea of interdisciplinarity and the balance between, like, not saying everything to every discipline, but also with a specific thing at the IRC, they're very much interested in grounding it in a particular field, but also making it as relevant as possible. If that's any help to you, Orla.
Rasika or Noreen, do you want to?
Yeah, sorry, so Rasika, do you want to go? The thing I had to say about interdisciplinarity is, when it comes to something like the Leverhulme, fundamentally, the first stage of your application, you're applying to a department. The department has to decide whether they want you or not. So in terms of interdisciplinarity, it's a balancing act. You want to show a department, I am a member of your department, I fit here. You don't want them to be like, well, why are you applying for English? You look more like your history of art. What you want to do, in my opinion, is to have a compelling narrative about why you belong in that department, but also have like a nice liberal sprinkling of interdisciplinarity on the surface of that. People love interdisciplinary projects. People love projects they can sell as interdisciplinary to external funders or whatever. But there's this double thing going on, that they also want the security of knowing that this person is firmly, in my case, an English studies person. It's not fair, right? Yeah, that seems to be the double thing that goes on in people's minds. So just bear that in mind, that you've got you've got what people think they want and what they actually want, I think, to balance.
Yeah, I agree completely with Noreen, actually. And actually, projects do tend to be interdisciplinary in that sense, but I do think it's important to focus on the project and, of course, the department. Those two things are really key to remember, yes.
Perfect, thank you so much. There seem to be a few questions as well about timeline, and I know you've all alluded to that in different ways, but I wonder if we might want to expand a little bit about how far before the end of the PhD you began thinking about this and applying, how you developed your ideas in the midst of trying to finish a PhD project, and how you made yourselves competitive being so close to the end of the PhD, with possibly not necessarily having Viva in hand or very shortly after Viva. So maybe Stephen? No, sorry, I can start with Stephen, just because you were where you're on my screen, sorry. Rastika, would you like to come in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just very quickly, I think by the time you read your thesis draft, I don't know, like for the millionth time, you know the loopholes in it already. So you have a very complicated relationship with your draft. You like it, you don't like it, and you have all kinds of feelings about it. And I think it's really good to actually own that and to sit with it. And it's okay to feel all of that. But I think ideas for new projects really come from there. And it's good to know what you haven't been able to address. And some of us will also write that in our thesis, in fact, what the scope of it has been and what one hasn't been able to address. And those are sort of the ideas which can crystallize potentially into new projects. I think I can stop there, and maybe Noreen or Stephen can.
Go ahead. Noreen, maybe, do you want to come in?
Yeah. So yeah, in my case, I've never been very good at focusing on just one thing at once. It's been important for my sanity to have little kind of side projects or other things going on. So in my case, as I say, my thesis project was on aphorism. Then I found this other kind of aspect that sort of was part of the aphorism project, but of which only a small part was relevant to aphorism. So in that case, it was the word flat and the idea of flatness, and what might be rhetorically flat and what flat style might be. And I actually thought, okay, there's a whole other book in that. And that when you have that kind of moment where you have to be like, no, I have to be strict with myself, only this bit is relevant, that can feel like a problem for the PhD, but actually it's this amazing, it's exactly what you want to happen when you're planning a postdoc. So for me, that little seed occurred in my second year when I found this interesting aspect. I was like, so I gave a little talk on that. And then I started sort of developing it, and it was sort of PhD chapter, but then as I say, I cut it out of the final book draft and just used it for the postdoc. So yeah, I guess, and that can happen at any time. It can be something that you encountered during your first year that you thought, I'll just park this for now because it's not strictly relevant. Or it could be something that springs up at you in the last few months. Or equally, maybe you need to take a little bit of time out after the PhD. Maybe you need a bit of a rest for your brain to kind of wake up again. I know people who've done all of those things and got postdocs. So I think there's not one right answer. I would say if you have one of those little seed ideas, don't discount it just because you're at an earlier stage of your PhD, but equally don't panic if you don't have one yet. So it's a how long is a piece of string type answer.
I only have, that's absolutely, I agree with everything that's been said. The only thing I would add to this is that there are obviously time limited things, so be aware of the deadlines as well. But also that the IRC only lets you apply twice, which probably there are limits that other people know for other applications as well. So that if you sort of don't feel under pressure, I think as Noreen's kind of alluded to, at the end of your PhD that you have to do something else. You have to absolutely have a postdoc kind of idea in hand. Take your time to think about it, because it will actually be what you should publish on, and so you can't just do something and throw it all away. But also that that certain things will obviously will stop you from doing it later on. The last thing I would say is that the best thing about getting a postdoc is not having to apply for another one, because I'm looking for like a year or so. So looking at these things, it's something that, I'm thinking about. I think it's one of the questions as well, thinking about what I have to do, after this is over. And it's part of the difficulty of that, I think, whenever you have a 1-year post, is that you basically have to start applying immediately after you get it. So one of the interesting things about which you have a privilege with, I think, with a sort of 2-year postdoc, is that you kind of don't have to sort of necessarily think about what you're doing next for a while. And I can't even imagine what it was like, or what it would be like now to think about that during a PhD as well. So yeah, just tailoring it to what you're doing and what kind of schemes are out there is kind of important as well.
Just on that point, Stephen, that you raised about the 1-year programs, there's a question specifically from Kira about the 1-year IRC. Does anybody have any experience with those, or are we all thinking on the 2-year program? Because I suppose that links with the forward planning that you were talking about as well in any other question, Suzanne's question.
I have an experience with applying for one, Kira. So I know I did apply for one before, and actually exactly what I was saying there is that, like, I hadn't even graduated from my PhD when I was applying, and I put in a full application process. So this is before the Viva was even done. And that's kind of, an important thing. The Viva, like, not to go into all that, but the Viva might be an interesting way to think about other postdocs as well. So not having had that conversation is kind of important. But the 1-year postdoc, yeah, it's essentially envisaged, or at least was envisaged from the start, as being a kind of transition your PhD into a book. Now that's kind of a discussion I think you need to have at the level of Viva. I know that, like, the difference between that and the 2 years is basically that you probably will have conceived a new project. So I don't think you're basically, in the IRC's case, meant to have necessarily have developed it as much for 2-year projects in the first one. And I'm sure there's many other things that could be attached to that. So if anyone else has anything, Noreen or Sika, I don't know. No.
That's all right, and that's perfect. Thank you very much. It's really helpful, and there are other schemes too out there that are specifically, thesis to book years, like MHRA has one, for example, and things like that. So it's helpful to know that IRC conceives of that in the same way. So we have a question from Peter, which is actually something that struck me as well, Noreen, in what you said with regards to kind of the breaking down of the project into very set kind of specific chunks, and then the outputs that will come from each of those. So I'll read the question in full. So yes, I intend to apply for a 2-year IRC postdoc. My main outcome would be a monograph, but I'm not sure that I could complete the writing of that in 2 years. Have you any advice on how to approach that in an application? He doesn't want the project to seem unfinished before he's even begun, but wants it to be realistic.
So my take on that would be that when you apply, yeah, absolutely, don't promise a whole book. You can't write a whole book in 2 years unless you've done. When I applied for the IRC, I was finishing my Durham postdoc, and I applied being like, I've done this postdoc, I've drafted most of this book, but it's not finished yet. And I want to add this extra angle. And I'm going to rewrite some of these chapters, kind of make the scope bigger. So can I have this 2 years to do that? Now, if you haven't, that was my take. It was like, for that 2 years, it was kind of finishing off a book. It was expanding a book that had already been partly written, and which I wanted to sort of expand the scope for and develop. If you are applying without the initial postdoc, the way I would approach it is to say, well, I know what all my chapters are going to be. This is the outline of all of my chapters. I know that during the postdoc, I can realistically write X number of chapters. The idea would then be to seek a permanent job and ultimately to write my, say, last chapter alongside the permanent job with an eye to getting a publisher in X date, X year. So that's what I would say. You want to show that you have the whole graph in your mind. You also want to show that 2 years is not enough to do it, but you want to show that you do have an ultimate publication plan beyond the end of the postdoc for the whole book. Does that make sense?
Just to add one thing to that would be sort of have a deadline to prepare a book proposal, really. And I think that's really important, and it's considered really crucial in applications. So I think the last chapter, the suggestion about the last chapter is really great. But also just have a few months to write the book, write a book proposal, really. That would.
Great. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for that. There is a question as well about the timeline of these schemes, which can be tricky depending on your funding period. And yeah, so I'll read the question in full rather than waffling. So are you aware of any fellowship schemes that operate under application timescales other than call for application in October, March decision, and September entry, or schemes accept applications pre-Viva? for example, if, sorry, it's anonymous, so if this person was to be awarded their doctorate at an awkward stage, e.g. March 2023, would they have to apply for fellowship starting in September 24, or what opportunities would be available to fill that gap of around 18 months?
I think the Lieber-Hume study abroad is the one that I would encourage them to apply for. I don't think you need to have a 5 or even a PhD handed into that stage. I think you can actually do it as a PhD student. So I think that's the one that they're kind of talking about, and it can be over like, I think 12 to 24 months as far as I know. So that's one which might be of interest in some way. Of course, it has the caveat that it has to be sort of it can't be in Britain or the north of Ireland, so it has to be like in somewhere in Europe or in the south. But yeah, that's the one that strikes me. I don't know if anyone else knows any other ones.
Just to say that I was almost in that situation. So I vivaed in February, and I was awarded my PhD in April. But the thing is, with something like the Lieber-Hume, you just have to have vivaed. You have to have been awarded your PhD by the time you would take up your post. So in that case, you can apply, and I did pre-award, pre-vivaing, whatever. But partly because the internal application deadlines take such a long time. Yeah. So to answer your question, yeah, it's possible, and it can be done. But yeah. And the other thing to be aware of is library fellowships at individual libraries. If you find yourself one of these awkward, like not quite lining up with timelines, do have a look at things like the Huntingdon Library, what's it called? The Houghton Library at Harvard, the Beinecke in Yale, and just sometimes you can slot together lots of kind of mini fellowships to fill in any awkward sort of shapes of things. Yeah, that's another thing worth thinking about.
Excellent, thank you so much. So we possibly take one final question in our last minute, which is just with regards to budgeting. I'm not so sure for postdocs if there are postdocs that ask you to devise a budget of your own. Some there are, okay. So maybe, Noreen, you're nodding, so maybe you'd like to come in on that and see, rather than maybe schemes that are sort of salaried as such, that there's extra funding budgets to be designed.
Well, the Lieber-Hume asks you to do a very basic budget. The ILC asks you for much more, quite a fairly developed budget. I suppose all I have to say about that is I'm really happy to share those documents with anyone who'd like to see them. Yeah, that's all I have to say, really. I can show you my budgets.
Okay, excellent, perfect. And I'm conscious of time, and Alison has appeared, so that's always a nice reminder that we're coming to the end of our session. So I'd just like to thank everyone again, thank our speakers for sharing so openly from their experience. Thank you to all of you for attending and for your wonderful questions. And I'll just reiterate our thanks again to all those who have been involved in the organisation of today, in making it possible through finance and in technical support as well. And remind you that the final session for today is going to begin at 4 o'clock. So after a half-hour break now, and we'll be thinking about European schemes. And just please remember to go back to Eventbrite and make sure you're in the right link for the session, because it will be a different link for our final session of the day. Okay, so thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you in half an hour.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.